little bit different. Do I just click out of that, Stephanie?
Yeah, it was just telling us it's recording. Go ahead.
Got it. Okay, got it. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to begin my prayer with 3 other prayers that are short poems, really, / prayers from a book that I've had for a very long time that I've always loved, called Prayers for the Ark and the Creatures Choir, by a woman named Carmen Bernot. These poems, there are 26 of them. They're very short, and they're poem-like prayers that are offered to God by animals. I thought this would be appropriate today. The first is the donkey. Oh God, who made me to trudge along the road always, to carry heavy loads always, to be beaten always. Give me great courage and gentleness. One day let somebody understand me, that I may no longer want to weep because I can never say what I mean and they make fun of me. Let me find a juicy thistle and make them give me time to pick it. And Lord, one day, let me find again my little brother of the Christmas crib. The next is the giraffe. Lord, I who see the world from above find it hard to get used to its pettiness. I have heard it said, you love humble creatures, the chatter of apes. It is easier for me to believe in your greatness. I feed on exalted things, and I rather like to see myself so close to your heaven. Humility, chatter of apes. And the last one is the elephant. Dear God, it is I, the elephant, your creature, who is talking to you. I am so embarrassed by my great self, and truly it is not my fault if I spoil your jungle a little with my great big feet. Let me be careful and behave wisely, always keeping my dignity and poise. Give me such philosophic thoughts that I can rejoice wherever I go in the lovable oddity of things. Let us pray. Dear God, we ask that you now hear our prayer. Enlarge our faith, that it informs our understanding of the entirety of your creation. Enlarge our hope that our attention to creation will be sustaining to all life forms. Enlarge our love, that we may grow more aware each day of the beautiful gift that you have entrusted to us.
Thank you, Missy.
You're welcome.
Well, let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. Jones before he starts. He's a veterinarian and zoologist by training and was the director of the North Carolina Zoo for over 20 years. Before that, he was the CEO of the Zoological Society of London and has spent his entire career, which is more than 5 decades, in the wildlife and zoo management field. He has worked in more than 50 countries, mainly in Africa and the Middle East. He has been on the councils of both the World Wildlife Fund in the US and the United Kingdom, and was the former chairman of the Fauna and Flora International, the world's oldest conservation organization. I also want to tell you a little bit about his churchy background. He was born into a Welsh Methodist family on both sides of his mother and his father. And his father ultimately became a rector of the Church of England parish just north of London, where David grew up. He started working his father started working as an itinerant Methodist preacher, traveling across the Mid Wales area from chapel to chapel. David was a boy chorister in St. Paul's Cathedral. Maybe you can sing a little song for us. But since coming to North Carolina, he and his wife, Janet, have been long members of the First United Methodist Church in Asheboro. And that's where he is this morning, in Asheboro, North Carolina. So we're so thankful that you're here, and we'll let you have the floor.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Missy. Yes, as Stephanie had just mentioned, I grew up in what was then a very rural part just north of London. It's very much in commuter country now. And the house we grew up in, father was what was called a rector, an Anglican priest, but a rector. The rector was always the priest of an older parish. And so I grew up in one of these Georgian rectories, 200-year-old house that beloved of sort of Jane Austen novels. If you follow any of the PBS series that sort of depicts the time, the 17th and 18th century, it was a house like that, very, very cold and rather damp in the winter. But it had land with it. It had about 10 acres of land, and that sort of piqued my initial interest as a child in wild things and the environment. And after school, I applied, not thinking anything would happen, to the Zoological Society of London, who were advertising the first full-time veterinary officer post in their country station at Whipsnade. London Zoo is only about 30 acres. It's a very typical sort of urban zoo, dating from 1826. Whipsnade was founded in the 1920s and was one of the first open zoos. And at the time that I joined as a veterinarian, a young veterinarian straight out of college, there were only six or seven full-time veterinarians in the whole of Western Europe in zoos. Today, there are over 400. That gives you an idea of the way things have progressed in sort of 50 plus years. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our own zoo, a bit about the history of zoos, because that's quite interesting, and particularly what has happened in the last few decades, because they've really changed dramatically in their appearance and in their value to the community, and not only the local communities, but also the community at large. Talk a little bit about what our zoo is doing in both the local and the global conservation field, and then just talk briefly about the big conservation challenges that we have today. As Stephanie mentioned, I've been on the board of a number of conservation organizations, and I'm still on the board of a couple of those. So I keep fairly well up to date with sort of what's happening on a global basis. Zoos, animal collections, menageries really, of course, have been around since pharaonic times and were particularly popular in the Roman and Greek empires. They didn't treat their animals particularly well, as you know, but really the day of the modern, what one might, inverted commas, modern zoo, that starts really in the 1820s, 1830s, really alongside the development of biological science. It was a time that, the Grand British Empire and others were exploring the world and were coming across new species on a regular basis. And indeed, the original purpose of the Zoological Society of London was stated as to demonstrate the new and curious subjects of the animal kingdom. So collections at that time, and London was one of three, there were only three publicly open zoos at that time, Vienna, Paris, and London. Vienna and Paris were slightly earlier. All came out of royal collections of one sort that were then transferred to a site and run by a scientific society. And really, those sort of conditions, what I call the sort of steel and concrete exhibits, when I first went to London and Whipsnade in the late 60s, there was still a cat house being literally a row of concrete and metal cages with a lion and a tiger and a leopard and so on. It was a collection of animals. And throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, basically zoos were for gawping at. They were just showing specimens. Then what we saw, probably post-World War II really, was a greater interest in the science of animal sciences. And of course, zoos, because of their varied collections of animals, became quite important centres of comparative science. And London Zoo certainly was one of the leaders in that field. But I think what's most dramatic is what's really happened in the last 50 years. And I've been lucky enough to be a part of that. It's really a dramatic change within the last 50 and even really the last 30 years. When I started at Whipsnade, there was no published literature, really, not to talk of, on the care of species other than domestic animals. In vet college, of course, one had the classic textbooks of cattle medicine and horse shoeing and all of that, but there was absolutely nothing on non-domestic animals, on wild animals. So we had to sort of play it very much by ear in terms of how one treated particularly larger animals that needed quite a lot of handling. When I started at Whipsnade, there was for instance, almost no information on anesthesia or immobilization. Whipsnade is still is a specialist collection of large mammals. So 3,000 mammals larger than a spaniel. So everything from a wallaby to an elephant. And we had quite a lot of elephants and rhinos. They weren't exactly the sort of animals that you just handled willy-nilly without any sort of sedation. And so we had to learn a great deal during those early decades, 60s and 70s, about safe handling of animals. And that became a speciality of mine. But it was something that we absolutely needed and is sort of every day now. One doesn't even think about it in terms of safe anesthesia and handling. If you don't have that, then you can't really do anything else. You haven't got the ability to diagnose or treat, which you have today. The other big changes, and you can see it in our own zoo, is the quality of exhibits. We've gone in those 50 years very much from the concrete and the metal to large, open, I have to say very expensive exhibits, but often modeled on the habitats that the animals come from. If you've not been recently, our polar bear, our new polar bear, I say new, it's about 6-7 years old now, but our polar bear exhibit is a very fine example of the way things have changed in the last 20 or 30 years. So exhibits have changed, they've become much higher quality. Interpretives, the way that one actually explains an animal's biology and its jigsaw piece, its piece in the wider jigsaw of living things, have improved immeasurably. Again, 50 years ago, you would walk past a series of cages and it would say tiger, lion, leopard. Absolutely no effort to explain the background to these animals. So interpretives have improved immeasurably. But perhaps the greatest change of all has been in cooperation. Again, when I started, animals were sold regularly. If you moved an animal from one zoo to another, animals were sold at huge prices. If you had a gorilla and it was available to another zoo, it would cost, and I'm talking about 1960s now, $100,000. And of course, the result of that was zoos were very competitive about what they had. If you had a gorilla or maybe even a giant panda, goodness, that was how zoos were judged as good or major zoos. And that has changed dramatically. We've had to do that because animals are no longer available from the wild. There's almost no animal species now in zoos that's regularly taken from the wild. And in fact, quite the opposite is happening because of so many successful breeding programs, particularly with endangered species. There are many, many, many examples here in the US. The California condor, for example, wouldn't exist today without the captive breeding of zoos like San Diego and Los Angeles. The black-footed ferret, which is the main predator on prairie dogs in the Dakotas, was thought to be extinct until a small colony was found about 30 years ago, very small, 6 or 7 animals. And now there are about 400 ferrets, black-footed ferrets in the wild. and a good captive population too. In our own zoo, the red wolf, for example, many of you have probably read the sort of recent history of the red wolf. There is a small population that's been reintroduced in the Alligator River Reserve, has not done very well because there's still a lot of fear of wolves, which is actually pretty ridiculous because this animal is extremely shy, is nowhere near the weight of the grey wolf, and is on the whole is very rarely seen. But you still hear stories of people thinking that wolves are going to jump into a baby's pram and throttle the youngster. They still seriously think that in some areas. So we hold at the North Carolina Zoo currently 34 wolves. It's quite a good breeding population. And there are other zoos cooperating in the red wolf program around the country. There's about 300 red wolves, and many of those youngsters are available for reintroduction. And indeed, there is discussion going on now. There was a big battle between our wildlife authorities and the Fish and Wildlife Service, Federal Fish and Wildlife Service, about whether that program should be continued. There was incidentally an effort to reintroduce them in the Appalachians near Blowing Rock at one point, but there's simply, you may disagree with this, there were not enough deer in the population in the mountains, would you believe it, to actually sustain a wolf population. And so that the remnant, there were a few animals left over in the Smokies, and they had to be brought back into captivity. But there's a great deal of close cooperation. And whereas, 40 years ago, there was something like 40, 50 gorillas, I'm just picking that as an example, in American zoos, very poor breeding going on. Gorillas, like humans and many other animals, have a preference for their own. So that what started was a gorilla stud book, and there are now 400 stud books around the country, mostly of rare animals. And there are something like 450 gorillas now within the national breeding program. Now, there is, of course, an international exchange as well. It's difficult because of quarantine regulations and so on. And right now, with COVID, it's been extremely difficult to move animals between countries. But there is quite a strong international movement, cooperative movement, particularly with endangered species. So the purpose of zoos has moved on considerably in those 4 or 5 decades. And although one still gets questions about, when are you going to get some new animals from Africa? And one sort of painstakingly explains that actually most of the animals that we breed that are endangered are going back to Africa, not in the other direction. And a lot of people still have a very traditional view of the zoo world. Our own zoo is the largest in acreage in the world. A lot of people don't realize that, but when I came, it was big then, about 1,000 acres. This is about 25 years ago, but partly because one could see what was going to happen in terms of expectations of space in zoos, and partly because development in the Triad region here obviously has increased considerably. I wanted to make sure that we had enough land to buffer the zoo and also to have enough land for future generations to have many options in terms of expansion. So our 2,000 acres, with about 500 is open to the public. Our 2,000 acres is much the envy, I have to say, of many of our zoo colleagues who have to still deal with, a 30-acre Philadelphia zoo or a 60-acre, 50, 60 acres is a fairly typical number for many zoos around the country. Unfortunately, because of my background in the London Zoo, and of course, London Zoo being a fairly ancient scientific institution had and still has tremendous networks of contacts throughout the world. When I came, and the zoo was fairly young then, it's only about 40 years old now. It had been building almost non-stop for 20 years. What it did not have was any sort of sense of a long-term program in education, in field conservation, international networks, and so on. And so, quite apart from building new exhibits, the really critical thing to do over those last 20, 30 years has been to build up particularly our international profile. And we now have quite a large international conservation department, mainly focusing on Africa, and mainly, again on gorillas, on the endangered populations of subspecies of gorillas, and particularly a subspecies called the Cross River gorilla in Nigeria, on the border of Nigeria and Cameroon. Also been doing a lot of work with forest elephants. This is actually now thought to be a completely new species of elephant, originally a subspecies, but again in West Africa. These are animals that exist just within dense forest, and more recently on big cats as well. And very often this is working with governments and with other not-for-profits. In North Carolina, we do quite a lot of work on particularly reptiles and amphibia, salamanders, rare frogs. You probably know that North Carolina is the epicenter of salamanders. There are 44 species of salamanders, and they're finding new ones sort of once a decade. And many of them are highly endangered, mainly because of our loss of wetlands. And so we've been working a lot on rare frogs, salamanders, some rare plants. We have, those of you that know the zoo well, will know that it has a very large horticulture department. At London Zoo, I think I had 6 gardeners in the third, and they were called gardeners, not horticulturalists. We have 44 horticultural staff in our zoo here. And it shows when you walk around that zoo, it's a pretty impressive botanical collection. So we also work on rare plants, working with some of the botanic gardens as well. Around the world, we think, we don't know for certain, that there are about 8,000 to 10,000 zoos open to the public globally. Only about 10% of those have any sort of welfare standards. And when I was at London Zoo, there was a big rise in the anti-zoo movement. That happened both in Europe and in America, particularly in the 70s and 80s. Very anti the keeping of any animal in captivity. And in many cases, criticism was correct. But the trouble was the zoo world sort of largely ignored it, and largely ignored what was happening with a lot of third world countries where a lot of the criticism started. So that the media, for example, would get hold of some horrid story from a zoo in Indonesia, let's say. And the animal welfare, animal rights people would latch onto that and try and sort of do something about it, but they didn't have the knowledge or the resources to do that. And it struck me that this is 30 years ago. Struck me that it was high time the responsible zoo world really had their own organization to deal with these sort of situations. And so 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago, I founded an organization called Wild Welfare, which is the only not-for-profit in the world that actually focuses entirely on bad zoos, and either how to close them down, which is difficult, or to just improve them. And many of these places want to be improved. They just don't have the resources or the knowledge to do that. And so we have a staff of 6 currently, with consultants adding into that, who travel well when they can, to try to help zoos that are in not such good shape to get into better shape. And that involves a lot, mostly training. it involves a lot of local politics, I might say, in trying to get zoo directors and mayors of cities to understand that welfare, proper welfare of animals is really very important in their care. So we work a lot in Southeast Asia. I just had a team fly out early this morning to Sabah, which is Borneo, it's Malaysian Borneo, working with the Bornean Wildlife Department on they have issues, as most countries with elephants do, of wild elephants causing a lot of problems with agriculture. And they have 17 elephants that they've had to bring in because of being doing a lot of damage to crops, and they have nowhere to put these elephants in the long term. So I have a team going out. They left at 5 o'clock this morning, in fact, to fly to Sabah to try and they're going to be there for a month, helping the Sabah government do something about these elephants, and partly to see whether we can get them back into the wild as well. And that's just one example of many of the things that we do on the welfare front. That incidentally started when American troops took over Kabul in Afghanistan in, what was it, 20 years ago anyway. And many of you may remember there was a story, highly publicized story, of the blind lion, Marjan. And CNN and the BBC all got very worked up about this. Anyway, because I have had long-term contacts and I worked quite extensively in Pakistan and India, took on the responsibility for the American Zoo Association of raising resources, money, and people to help with Kabul Zoo. And we raised $600,000 in 6 weeks, which went into, from about 6,000 people. And that went in to help Kabul Zoo. We worked with Kabul Zoo for about 4 years, improved it a lot, but not to where we would ideally have liked. But that was really the start of the sort of funding of wild welfare and the work that we're doing currently. So let's talk a little bit about conservation in general, a bit more about what zoos are doing in conservation, but perhaps just look at some of the challenges and particularly how they might affect our region. In my view, and a lot of people would differ perhaps on this, is that there are 4 key areas that we need to watch very carefully in the coming years. And you'll be familiar with some of these. Obviously, climate change is one. The health of the oceans is another. The issues around pollution and waste, and that includes issues of energy and alternative energy and so on, and overuse of resources. On natural history will probably already have thought about what's going to happen in our own region. The Appalachian region is going to see a lot of change. Over the next century, we're going to see a huge amount of change as a result of climate change. We're going to see plant movement to the north. That sounds a bit odd in a way. You can imagine all these trees marching northwards. But the reality is what's going to happen is because the climate is warming, some species, for dogwoods, for example, are probably not going to survive as far south as they are today. We're going to see movement of particularly amphibian species, for example, again, with warming. And there's a whole range of migratory birds of which our area, the Appalachian forest, is really, really important for migratory tropical warblers in particular, and probably what's going to happen. It's already happening to a degree. It's already, Cornell and Audubon are reporting already warbler movements generally to the north, away from their traditional nesting grounds. So we're going to see a lot of change, and that's obviously not just in our area, but on a global basis. Habitat loss is probably another major one, and that's a really big issue for large mammals. So elephants, big cats, particularly carnivores. We're seeing a huge drop in, for example, the lion population in Africa. Leopards, interestingly, are doing rather better. They're able to cope with urban environments. But lions and cheetahs, just to give you one example, one group of animals, those numbers are falling quite fast. And partly because of human competition. Obviously, cattle herders in Somalia or northern Kenya don't particularly want to see lions in the area. And you've got a human population that's growing quite fast in Africa at the moment. So you're going to see, and elephants particularly, elephants now that have been anyway reduced in numbers as a result of poaching in periods of sort of, you see poaching going in waves. At the moment, it's actually on the decline, but there's still a very much smaller number of elephants in Africa and in Asia than there were, say, 50 years ago. And the other problem there is because elephants are largely migratory in most of those populations, of course, they simply can't move in the ways that they did. 50, even as near as 50 years ago. On the pollution side, the big area to watch are our oceans. We've always tended to think that the oceans were sort of endless resource, which didn't really matter. Many countries still reckon that the oceans are a sort of dumping ground. You will all no doubt have seen the worries at the moment over plastic pollution. There's some interesting technologies coming out now that hopefully will begin to tackle that problem. I had a group, I quite regularly take groups on mostly natural history trips around the world. I had a group in Malaysia not so long ago, and it was quite appalling to see these beautiful beaches, which were beautiful beaches, just awash with plastic bottles, plastic bags, all sort of driven up into the little coves and valleys in the mangrove swamps were all full of plastic, quite appalling. And of course, a lot of these countries just don't have the resources or the will in many ways to deal with that. Another issue, another ocean issue is just overfishing. About a sixth, about 20%, a bit less than 20% of the world's population rely almost entirely on marine resources. If you think about where populations tend to focus, particularly in the developing world, most of them are coastal. And so not only have you got the problem of coastal climate change and rise in sea rise, countries like Bangladesh, for example, but those communities are also very dependent on their fishing resources. So you have two problems there. One is that developed countries, particularly countries like Japan, Russia, China, are fishing on a sort of industrial scale and taking away the resources of many of these coastal fishing communities. So overfishing is a major problem. Of the 17 salmon species, for example, only one is actually being managed sustainably. And that's actually the wild Alaskan salmon fishery is the only one that's being managed. Every other salmon fishery is declining around the world. And that's true of many things. Anyway, it all sounds a bit depressing, but actually there are a lot of people now, and you've seen it yourselves, a lot of people, and particularly young, this new generation of young adults is far more interested and keen on dealing with these issues than sadly my generation and the generation between the 20-year-olds and my ancient status. So hopefully we're going to see a lot more optimism coming in the world about conservation issues. And Stephanie, I'm going to leave it there and open it up for questions, if I may. Yeah.
Wait, no, don't turn it.
we have a question here.
I have a question. How do zoos and aquariums work together, given the inherent linkage you're drawing between land species and ocean species?
You mean how do they work together? There's of course a lot of overlap. I mean, many zoos have watery exhibits, let's say, and many aquariums. Now, if you look at our own 3 aquariums here in North Carolina, actually have quite a lot of mammals and birds as well. So there isn't quite as much sort of distinction between them as one might imagine. And the American Zoo Association, about 250 members, has about 60 aquariums within that 250 membership. So there is a pretty, I'm just trying to think, yeah, I mean, otters, for example, there are 3, probably a bit more, 4 species of otters that are kept regularly by zoos and aquariums. So the Asian short-clawed otter, just to give you one example, there is a stud book for that species, and both aquariums hold them and zoos hold them. So there's, it's just one example of many species which are jointly held by either zoos or aquariums.
Mike has a question.
So Dr. Jones, what can families and congregations do to support conservation and to support high quality zoos and your efforts to improve or eliminate those underperforming zoos?
Sorry, I didn't get that. I'm sorry. The mask, I think, probably muffled you a bit.
Okay, so the question really is, what can we do to help as a congregation and as individuals to support conservation efforts locally and worldwide, and to help with your efforts to improve underperforming zoos?
Did you say what can individuals do?
Right. Through individuals and congregations like ours.
Oh, I see. Well, the zoo has a very strong membership. Thinking now about just individuals, our zoo has a strong membership. About 30,000 households in North Carolina are members of the zoo. So many of those people and the families do contribute through their membership to the field conservation work, whether it's here in North Carolina or elsewhere. And so obviously a lot of those people are church folks. I'm not sure how a congregation can directly, I mean, obviously the zoo publishes quite a lot. We certainly have a lot of staff talking within communities all around North Carolina, I mean, mostly in the Triad region, obviously. The zoo has quite a big outreach program, which in many cases does reach churches and congregations. So a lot of it, I think, is just awareness and helping folks to understand what the needs are.
Hey, Stephanie, this is Cully. Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I would encourage all of you who are on this call, and if you have not visited the North Carolina Zoo, you ought to do so. As David pointed out, it is among, if not the best, finest zoo in the world. And it was a red letter day when Dr. Jones agreed to come from London to North Carolina to be the director of the North Carolina Zoo, because he brought with him ideas beyond just, showing off animals. People go to the zoo to see animals, but they forget about all the other programs and all the other work that takes place as a result of the zoo, like conservation and protection of animals and things like that. But if you have never visited the North Carolina Zoo at Asheboro, you owe it to yourself to do so. and you will come away being very proud of your state and very proud of that zoo staff and the manner in which they protect and look after the animals. They are available to be seen if they want to be seen, because they're in natural habitats. And sometimes they decide they're going to stay on the other side of the field and just not show up where you're standing. But it's a wonderful zoo, and I would encourage all of you to go and visit if you haven't done so. And I'd like to thank Dr. Jones. I had the rare pleasure of serving on the Zoological Park Council when David first came to the zoo, and served for a number of years with him. And he is a world-class, not only zoo director, but citizen. And we're very fortunate to have him in our state.
Thank you, Cully. And Cully was a very supportive council member, I might say, too, and a long time one.
Dr. Jones, I'm curious, what are you most worried about in terms of conservation? And then what brings you hope?
Oh, it's a good question. I think what brings me hope is the attitudes of the sort of 10 to 30-year-olds now. Much greater interest, much greater knowledge, of course, of environmental matters, and much greater, just much greater involvement than we ever saw in sort of my generation and the generation of my children. Although my children are that's rather odd one, because obviously they grew up in the environment, but that age group were not so interested as youngsters are now. And I think the greatest threat probably is global poverty, which may sound a bit odd, but if you look at where global resources are being overused, so as I said, fisheries, forestry, declining agricultural production, if we don't deal with populations that are living in subsistence, and we're looking at, close to 50% of the world's population are not either living in secure areas or in food secure areas. And so all the things that we might do in the developed world to improve environmental and conservation needs are going to be nothing unless we deal with global poverty. Because if you take, for example, the continent of Africa, which obviously has probably the most diverse selection of big mammals, none of those animals are going to survive if you haven't got the will of the local community to help do that. And they have to have a benefit from that. That's why tourism in many areas is very important. So I think global poverty and the solutions to global poverty are really the biggest threat to global conservation generally.
I had someone send me a question, Betty Womack. She asks, what is the rarest and most expensive animal at the North Carolina Zoo?
Well, when you say, that's an interesting question about expensive. Because as I said earlier, money really doesn't change hands now, thank goodness. If it did, I suppose you'd be thinking gorillas, polar bears, the sort of highly charismatic animals. But fortunately, thank goodness, money really doesn't, other than the transport costs of moving animals, which can be very considerable, money doesn't play a part in it. Rarity, polar bears, gorillas, chimpanzees, some of our hoofed stock, 2 or 3 of the species of antelope and so on, they're all quite rare. And some of our birds, some of our smaller birds that you can see in the aviary are amongst Hawaiian species, for example, quite a number of Asian species that are still in very small numbers in the wild.
Stephanie, may I ask a question? David, can you hear me? Can you hear me, David? It's Missy.
Yes. Yep.
Did you just mention the Zoos Association for a long time with Jane Goodall? Tell them about how she has come to enjoy our.
The Chimp Exhibit. Yeah. Our Chimp Exhibit certainly is one of the best in the world, and Jane, she wasn't involved in the original design, but certainly she gave it very much the nod of approval when it was built. It's quite a large exhibit; it's about 2 acres. We actually extensively modernized it some years ago. I have to tell you another story about Jane. When I was at London Zoo and I was the veterinary officer at London Zoo, I used to do the pathology for Jane's chimpanzees. And Jane, when she was in the field at Gombe Stream, if she had chimpanzees dying and could obtain some sort of tissue from them as to the cause of death, would send them to me. The trouble was, I had to explain to Jane that if you put a bit of tissue in formalin, there's not much hope of actually diagnosing anything from it, and especially when you send it to me when the animal's been 6 weeks dead. But she did. She's done some wonderful work around the world, as you probably all know, and has had an association with our zoo, particularly with our primates.
Dr. Jones, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Jones, I have a question about climate change. Have you given up on our generation as far as believing in climate change? There's still a lot of people who don't understand it, don't believe it. Is there any way to convince somebody that climate change is real?
Are you saying, how do you convince people that it's real? It's very
right.
And I think there are always going to be a small number of people who won't, who want to find evidence that proves their view rather than the other way around. But unfortunately, over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly, I think because the evidence now is so clear. 15, 20 years ago, it wasn't as clear. There was certainly some reason for doubt, not that climate change was happening, but the sort of overall changes, were they actually all about climate change and climate? And the reality is of course, there are natural changes which contribute in that. But I think the evidence, it's very difficult, I think, to actually, I've tried many times to explain to non-believers that heavens, the evidence, my friend, is there. It's there. 99% of the world's climate scientists have shown without doubt that man is making a tremendous change. But you're quite right, that there will always be a few who will never believe it. Always a few.
Thank you.
Dr. Jones, I'd like to say thank you for this presentation. It does focus us on things that we have in North Carolina that Cully was a part of helping, and that you do too, which is several hours away from Western North Carolina, so it's a little bit remote. And then you've also focused us on global issues. We are so blessed here to live where we do, where most of us are located. We've got hundreds of thousands of acres out our back door, owned by the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and a number of land conservancies, all of whom are working on corridor connections so that native wildlife can move in an almost normal fashion across our landscape. And we do have otters, we've got black bears, we've got lots of deer, multiple flora and fauna. So we're trying to pay close attention to the U.S. Forest Service, since they're so dominant in Western North Carolina and across the United States. But they're finishing up on the 10-year Forest Service. And fortunately, I think there are some younger people now in the Forest Service who are more attuned to conservation than some of their predecessors who were more interested in logging, perhaps. With that said, we're interested in trying to do our part to stay knowledgeable, learn what's going on, and it looks promising, except every time we build a new subdivision here or another new summer home on top of a mountain, it's a bit of an issue. But thank you, sir, so much. And I guess we'd invite you to come and see us and see what we're doing here.
Well, I actually now have a house in West Jefferson. So I'm becoming much more familiar with the area.
Great. Well, there's several land trusts in West Jefferson around there, and they're all doing excellent work. We're very fortunate to have 2 or 3 within 50 miles of where we are that are doing outstanding conservation work.
We have another question.
Dr. Jones, if you were to counsel someone about visiting the zoo, what would you say that they might miss but should definitely see if they go to the zoo? Or what are the top sort of highlights that you think people should see if they follow Cully's encouragement and actually visit the zoo for the first time?
Yeah. Well, definitely, thinking about not just the animals themselves, but the standard of exhibit and presentation. Definitely polar bear, the newish polar bear exhibit is wonderful, and its interpretives are very interesting, especially if you've got children or grandchildren. The aviary is, and interestingly, the aviary is actually our oldest exhibit center in the zoo, dates back to the 1980s, and yet even today that is it's often voted amongst the top 10 zoo exhibits in the country. And the aviary is wonderful because it's not, often when you go to other zoos, these tropical exhibits are too big. They're so big, you can't maintain them. We have actually more horticulture staff than we have animal staff in the aviary, just to keep it in the condition it is. So it's not a particularly big building, but because of the way it's designed, it looks in sort of winding pathways through it. It just looks a lot bigger than it really is. And that's a wonderful place. And especially people that really love it are the winter visitors, because it's always warm. So we get a lot of people who come and just sit literally with a pair of binoculars and just watch the birds. There's usually between 80 and 100 birds in the exhibit at any one time. So that's great. And then you have to see the African plains exhibit, which is bigger. The plains exhibit on its own is bigger than Old London Zoo. And the various sight lines that you can get from the different overlooks is wonderful. You start with looking at the elephant exhibit, cross the elephant exhibit to rhinos and antelopes in the exhibits beyond. So if I were to pick those, polar bears, the aviary, and probably the big landscape of the African plains are probably choice exhibit, but there's so much more as well, so much more to see.
I think we have time for one more question. If anybody wants to hop in. Okay, we have someone who's written one in. What are your plans for expansion? I guess that means for the zoo expansion.
Yeah, one of the things, and Cully will remember this, one of the things that we struggle with in the sort of post building Africa and America was obtaining more resources to continue the development. And certainly for most of the years that I was there, it was very, the state government just didn't have that much money to spend. But now, the zoo has $100 million to spend on new exhibits. So there's 80 million of government money, obviously that because of because of the various federal funds and other funds flowing in, the state is in a pretty good financial condition right now. So it's 80 million, and the Zoo Society has raised close to 20 million. So that's going into 2 new continents. Asia will be the first one, with tigers and Komodo dragons and more primates, more monkeys. And then also a smaller Australian continent exhibit, which the species have not yet been decided for that. And that building, I think they're going to lay the ground stone, the initial stages of that will begin later this year. Probably take about 3 years to build Asia. But at long last, a sizable sum of money being pumped into the zoo.
Well, we are out of time. I think this has been so interesting, and thank you so much for all the work that you've done for so many years in conservation. What a gift it is to our state, but also to all over the world. So thank you so much, and thank you for spending time with us this morning. I've asked Alex Bernhardt to close us in prayer.
All right, let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and hallowed be your kingdom here on earth. We give you thanks for this creation and for all the manifold blessings on this planet Earth, with the lovely flora and fauna with which you have blessed us, including the blessing of wild things and wild places. Forgive us our debts, including our misuse of your earth, its climate, and all the animals that dwell therein. While thine is the kingdom, we guidance as to your will for how we can serve and tend to the beauty of this natural world that you have blessed us with. With humble thanks, we say, Amen.
Thank you, Alex. I also want to say a special thanks to Missy Rankin for inviting Dr. Jones to be with us this morning. And thanks to all of you for coming for the past 3 weeks. We're excited about the creation care efforts at Rumpel, and we invite any of you to join that group if you're interested. And just thank you so much, Dr. Jones. We appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, David. Great seeing you.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.